Elias Cole dropped the iron he was holding the moment he saw the rope. Not a lasso. Not a lead line. A rope tied at a woman's wrists, the other end gripped by a man in a county deputy's vest, who was dragging her down the center of Sawyer Creek's main street, like she was livestock headed for auction. She was hooded a grain sack pulled over her head, and her dress was torn at the shoulder, and her boots were leaving drag marks in the July dust because she had stopped walking on her own and was making them carry the weight of every step. Elias walked out of the forge. "How much?" he said. The deputy stopped, turned, looked at him the way men look at other men when they are trying to calculate the cost of a problem. "She ain't for sale," the deputy said. "Everything in this town is for sale," Elias said. "How much?" If you believe that a woman's truth is worth more than any man's money, stay with this story until the very end. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The deputy's name was Lon Grath, and he had been working for Douglas Hale long enough that the distinction between county law and Hale's personal instructions had stopped mattering to him sometime around the second year. He looked at Elias Cole the way he always looked at men who interfered with the particular contempt of someone who understood that contempt was the cheapest form of authority available to him. "You got business with this woman," Grath said. "I got business with what you're doing to her," Elias said. A small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk the way crowds gather in small Texas towns in July, slowly trying to look like they weren't gathering, watching from the corners of their eyes while pretending to be interested in the hitching post or the window of the dry goods store. Elias did not look at the crowd. He looked at the woman. She had gone still when he spoke. The hooded head had turned slightly in his direction, not toward the voice exactly, but tilting the way a person tilts when they are listening hard and trying to locate something they need. "$1, Grath said finally. "$1, and she's your problem. I got papers saying she's a ward of the county pending commitment hearing. You take her, you take the legal obligation." "Give me the papers," Elias said. Grath laughed. "You can't read, Cole. Everybody knows that." Elias reached into the pocket of his work trousers and produced a silver $1. He held it up between two fingers, the way you hold something you want a man to look at and understand the finality of. "Give me the papers," he said again. Grath took the $1. He handed over a folded document with the other hand and dropped the rope end in the dirt and walked away. And the crowd on the boardwalk watched Elias Cole crouch down and pick up the rope end and look at it for a moment, and then take out his work knife and cut it in two and drop both pieces in the dust. He stood. He reached up and lifted the grain sack from the woman's head. She blinked once in the full force of the July sun. Her hair was dark red and matted on one side where she had been against the ground. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. Her right eye was gray and sharp, and it found his face immediately, and it did not look away. "I don't need saving," she said. Her voice was low and steady, and it did not match her face, which was bruised and bleeding at the corner of her mouth. It matched something else, some interior thing that had not been touched by whatever had been done to her externally. "No," Elias agreed. "I reckon you don't." She looked down at her wrists where the rope had been. She looked at the cut ends in the dirt. She looked at the crowd on the boardwalk and at the empty space where Grath had been standing. "You paid $1 for me," she said. "I paid $1 for the county's legal obligation," he said, "which is different." She looked at him properly then. He was not what she had expected. She had expected another one of Hale's men, a different uniform, on the same arrangement. What she saw instead was a man in a leather apron with iron dust on his forearms and a face that looked like it had been through enough weather that nothing surprised it anymore. He was younger than she had assumed from the voice, not yet 40, she thought. Big through the shoulders in the way of men who work with their hands for a living. A dark beard kept but not trimmed with any vanity. Eyes that were doing what she was doing, reading. "Ruth McAllister," she said. She watched his face. Something moved across it. Not surprise. It was the thing that happens when a man hears a name that has been connected to something in his memory, and the connection fires before he can decide whether to show it. Elias Cole, he said. Now it was her turn. She recognized the name. She didn't know how, and then she did. The land survey records. Her father's office. A file she had read 3 years ago when she was first trying to understand the pattern of Hale's acquisitions. Cole family. 40 acres on the South Fork. Lost to foreclosure on a note that had been altered after signing. She looked at him. He looked at her. You lost land to Douglas Hale, she said. My father did, he said. Yes. So did mine, she said. In a manner of speaking. He was quiet for a moment. The crowd on the boardwalk had mostly dispersed now that the entertainment was concluded. One woman remained older, broad-shouldered, standing in the doorway of the laundry at the end of the block, watching with the careful attention of someone who has learned to watch everything without appearing to. You need to come inside, Elias said. Off the street. She started. You need to come inside, he said again, and something in his voice was not a command, but the opposite. The voice of someone stating a fact about the situation they are both standing in, offering the fact without pressure and without pretense. She came inside. The forge was hot, even with both doors open, and the small window on the north wall propped up. It smelled of coal and iron, and the particular mineral sharpness of water thrown on heated metal. Ruth stood in the center of it and pressed the back of her hand carefully against her swollen eye and looked around at the tools on the wall. Sit, Elias said. He was at the water barrel in the corner. I don't. You've been on your feet in the July heat for however long they had you, and your eye needs cold water, and you don't have to tell me a single thing, but you will sit down while we figure out what comes next. He said it the way he had said everything so far, flat, without ornamentation, without the performance of concern that she had learned to distrust. She sat on the low bench along the wall. He brought a cloth and the water, and set both beside her, and stepped back. She picked up the cloth herself. My father was Judge Clarence McAllister, she said. She had decided something while she was sitting down, some internal calculation completed. He was the circuit judge for this county for 14 years. 2 years ago, he issued a ruling against Douglas Hale on a water rights dispute involving 3 homesteader families. A month after that ruling, documentation appeared, suggesting my father had accepted payment to influence prior decisions in Hale's favor. Elias was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was listening in the way of someone who has trained themselves to listen, not preparing his response, just taking in what was being said. The documents were forgeries, she said. How do you know? Because I know my father's handwriting, she said. I know it the way I know my own. The letters in those documents were shaped by someone who had studied his signature, but did not understand that a man's handwriting changes depending on what he is feeling when he writes. My father pressed harder on the downstroke when he was certain of something. The forged documents had even pressure throughout. Someone careful. Someone patient. She paused. But not someone who knew him. Your father believed you. My father died before I could tell him. Something in her face did what faces do when they are containing something large. He knew the documents were false because he knew his own integrity, but he didn't know they were forgeries in the technical sense. He thought they were invented entirely. He went to his grave believing someone had simply lied about him. She lowered the cloth. I found out they were forgeries 3 months ago. How? A ledger, she said. She reached inside her dress at the left side, where the bodice had a small interior seam, a sewing pocket, the kind women have always known how to hide in plain fabric. She produced a small notebook, perhaps 4 inches by 6, bound in dark cloth, the cover warped from moisture and heat. Elias looked at it. He did not reach for it. My father kept notes on every case, she said. Not official records, personal observations. Names, dates, amounts when money changed hands in his presence. Conversations he thought significant. He kept them in a false bottom in the lower drawer of his office desk. She turned the notebook in her hands. After he died, Warren, my husband, had the office cleared out. I was there when they did it. I watched them take everything out and load it into a wagon for burning. Everything except that drawer, which was locked, and which Warren didn't know contained anything different from the others. You took it after, Elias said. I took it the night I left, she said. 14 days ago. He was quiet for a moment. The iron cooling on the anvil ticked as it contracted. Outside, the sound of the street continued its ordinary business. What's in it? He said. Names, she said. The names of every man who came to my father privately, not in court, privately to his home with money, favors, or threats over 14 years. My father wrote them all down. He wrote down who sent them. He wrote down what was asked. She looked at the notebook. Douglas Hale's name appears 11 times. Elias said nothing. There is something else, she said. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a folded edge. She held it toward him, not giving it over, just showing. 3 months before the forged documents appeared, a man named Bates, Reuben. Bates, the county land office clerk, came to my father's home on a Sunday evening. My father wrote down the exact date, the time, and the conversation. Bates told him that Douglas Hale had instructed him to file amended deed records on 4 properties, altering the original terms of purchase agreements. My father told Bates he would look into it. He wrote that Bates was frightened. He wrote that Bates's hands shook when he spoke. Bates is still the land clerk, Elias said. Yes. Still works for Hale. Yes. Which means whatever Bates came to your father about was enough to scare him in the short term and not enough to protect him in the long term, she said. Hale got to him again. And then the forged documents appeared, and my father was removed from the bench, and Bates is still sitting in that office filing amended deeds. She closed the notebook. My father's record of that conversation is the only evidence that Bates knew about the forgeries before they were used, which makes Bates the thread that unravels everything else. Elias pushed himself off the wall and moved to the forge and picked up a poker and worked at the coals that were still burning, not because they needed attention, but because he needed somewhere to put his hands while he thought. Why were you on that rope? He said. Because Warren reported me to the county as mentally unsound, she said. It is the legal mechanism available to a husband in this territory when his wife, in the language of the statute, demonstrates erratic behavior and flight from marital domicile. If a physician signs a certificate of instability, the wife loses her legal standing entirely. She cannot testify. She cannot hold property. She cannot file claims. She said it without heat, the way she said everything as a fact of the terrain, not as an injustice, she was still deciding how to feel about. Warren had a physician ready. I left before the certificate could be signed, but Grath caught me this morning at the creek crossing. The certificate isn't signed yet, Elias said. No. Then you still have standing. For however long that lasts, she said. Warren will have it signed within 2 days once he knows where I am. And he will know by morning. Elias set down the poker. He turned around and looked at her sitting on the bench with the notebook in her lap, and the swollen eye, and the cut at the corner of her mouth, and the absolute absence of self-pity in any of it. I need to reach a man named Jonas Webb, she said. He is the circuit marshal. He has jurisdiction over Hale's operations in a way that local law does not. If I can get this notebook to him before the certificate is signed. Webb is in Barrow, Elias said. 4 days' ride south. She absorbed that. Grath will have reported to Hale already, Elias said. By this evening, Hale will know you're free and where you are. He'll have men on every road south before morning. Then we need to not take the roads, she said. He looked at her. I said we, she said. I understand if that isn't something you want to be part of. You paid $1 for a legal obligation you did not ask for. That is more than most men would have done. I am not. She stopped, started again. I am not asking you to carry this with me. I'm telling you what I need so that you can make an informed decision about whether to be involved. The way she said it. Straight no performance. The same way she had said everything since he took the sack off her head. No appeal to sentiment, no manipulation, no pretense of helplessness. He thought about the legal papers in Grath's hand that he now held. He thought about the dollar in the dust. He thought about the name Cole in a file in her father's records. A file she had read without knowing she would ever be standing in this man's forge on a July afternoon, asking him to help her reach the one person who could make it matter. He thought about his father's land. The 40 acres on the South Fork with the good water. The year it was taken. The winter that followed. Margaret, 2 years after that, arriving in a town that had nothing left to offer her, and marrying a man who couldn't offer enough. He had not said Margaret's name out loud in 4 months. He reached up and touched his chest, left side briefly. Not performing the gesture. Just his hand finding the place it found sometimes before he was aware he was doing it. I know a way south that doesn't cross any road. Hale's men would think to watch, he said. It runs through the Casado Creek bed, then cuts east along the old cattle drive line that hasn't been used since '72. Adds half a day. But it comes out 2 miles from Barrow at a crossing Webb uses regular when he's in county. She looked at him. You know Webb. We've met, Elias said. He knows I don't lie to him. That's the only currency I have with him. That and the fact that he processed my father's land claim and found it irregular and couldn't prove why, and it has bothered him since. He paused. He is not a man who likes loose ends. Neither am I, she said. No, he said. I can see that. She stood. She tucked the notebook back into the interior of her bodice and smoothed the fabric over it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that it is muscle memory. There is a woman on this street, she said. Outside the laundry at the end of the block. She was watching when Grath had me. Delphine Okafor, Elias said. She's been here 12 years. Runs the best laundry between here and Amarillo. She was watching me, Ruth said, the way a person watches something they recognize. Not me specifically. The situation. She met his eyes. I want to speak to her before we leave. Elias considered that. We don't have much time before... I know how much time we have, she said. I need 10 minutes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the wall and took down a clean work shirt that had been hanging there. Not his best one, but clean and solid, and held it out to her. She looked at it. Your dress is torn at the shoulder, he said. It will draw attention. She took the shirt without comment. She turned away to change it over her dress, tucking it into the waist of her skirt, with the quick, practical movements of someone who has never had the luxury of vanity slowing her down. When she turned back, she looked different. Not less herself, more herself. Something about the plain work fabric settling around her shoulders looked like what she actually was, rather than what she had been dressed as. 10 minutes, Elias said. Then we move. He banked the forge coals, covered the ironwork that was not yet finished, took his rifle from the rack on the wall and his jacket from the peg by the door, the one with the deep interior pockets from his Pinkerton years, the ones he still wore out of habit, and because old habits held things that newer ones hadn't learned to hold yet. Ruth was already at the door. She stopped. She looked back at the forge at the anvil, where he had dropped his iron when he walked out to the street at the work half done on the bench. You left your work, she said. The iron will keep, he said. She looked at him one more time with the gray eyes that missed nothing, and then she walked out into the July sun, and he followed her and pulled the door shut behind them, and they walked together down the main street of Sawyer Creek toward the laundry at the end of the block, toward Delphine Okafor, standing in her doorway, still watching toward the beginning of everything that would come next. Overhead, the Texas sky was the particular blue of deep summer, cloudless and absolute, the kind of sky that gives nothing and takes everything, and has been doing both since before anyone had a name for either. The dollar was still in the dust in the middle of the street where Grath had dropped it. Nobody picked it up. Delphine Okafor did not move from her doorway when they approached. She watched them come the full length of the block, with the stillness of a woman who had learned long ago that moving toward trouble was a choice, and standing your ground was a different kind of choice, and both had consequences, and you picked the one you could live with. She was 55 years old, and she had the hands of someone who had worked in steam and lye since before she could see over a washboard. Her eyes were dark and precise, and they went to Ruth's face, first the swollen eye, the cut mouth, and then to the work shirt that did not belong to her, and then to Elias, and then back to Ruth. "You're McAllister's daughter," she said. Ruth stopped. "You knew my father." "Everybody in this county knew your father," Delphine said. "Some people knew him well. Some people knew him the way you know a good road. You don't think about it until it's gone, and then you feel every stone." She looked at Ruth steadily. "Come inside. Both of you. You're standing in the open, and Lon Grath drinks at the saloon 2 doors down, and he ain't on his second glass yet." The inside of the laundry was hot and smelled of clean things, which was its own particular comfort in a town that smelled of dust and livestock, and the various industries of men. Sheets hung on lines strung across the back half of the room. The front half had a long wooden counter, and behind it, a wall of shelves with garments wrapped in brown paper and tied with cord, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Delphine went behind the counter and did not offer them seats because there were no seats, and because the kind of conversation that was about to happen was not a sitting-down conversation. "What happened to you this morning?" she said to Ruth. "Grath picked me up at the creek crossing," Ruth said. "Warren reported me to the county. Instability petition." Delphine's expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled into a harder configuration. "Warren Tilden is a man who uses the law the way other men use a fence post," she said, "to keep things in place that would otherwise move." "That's a precise way to say it," Ruth said. "I've had 12 years to find the precise words," Delphine said. She looked at Elias. "You paid for her." $1, Elias said. "Legal transfer of custodial obligation." She looked back at Ruth. "What do you need from me?" Ruth looked at her directly. "I need to know if you have a garment in this shop belonging to a man named Reuben Bates." The silence that followed was brief, but specific, the kind of silence that is not absence of sound, but presence of thought. "Bates brings his things in every 2 weeks," Delphine said carefully. "Regular as a clock. Has for 6 years. Did he bring anything in recently, within the last 2 months?" Delphine turned without answering and moved to the wall of shelves. She ran her finger along the labels on the brown paper packages, not searching. Elias noticed, but confirming. She knew exactly where everything was. She pulled a package from the middle shelf and set it on the counter. "He brought this in 5 weeks ago," she said. "Never came to pick it up." She paused. "Which is unusual. He always picks up." Ruth reached across the counter, and Delphine let her undo the cord and fold back the brown paper. Inside was a dark vest, the kind a man wears when he wants to look like he has professional standing without spending the money for a full suit. Black wool slightly worn at the buttonholes. Ruth turned it over. She examined the left cuff, then the right. "There," she said quietly. She held it toward the light that came through the front window. Along the right cuff at the inside edge, there was a faint line of dried ink. Not a stain from careless writing, a transfer mark, the kind you get when you press your wrist against paper that is still wet with fresh ink. "What color is that to you?" she asked Delphine. Delphine looked. "Purple," she said. "Dark purple. Almost black, but not quite." Ruth set the vest down on the counter. Her hands were steady, but her voice had changed by 1 degree, not louder, not faster, but more pressurized, the way water sounds when the pipe narrows. "The forged documents that were used to remove my father from the bench were written in a very specific ink," she said. "A purple-black ink. I noticed the color when I first saw the documents because my father never used that color. He used standard black. He bought his ink from the general store here in town, same as he had for 20 years. She looked at Delphine. That ink color is sold at one place in this county. The stationery and office supply shop on the north end of Reed Street in Hale's main building. It is the ink used in Douglas Hale's offices. Delphine looked at the vest cuff, then at Ruth. Then she said something that was not quite a word, a sound of understanding that required no translation. Bates prepared those documents in Hale's office, Ruth said. And he came directly from that work to wherever he went next, and he was still wearing this vest when the ink was fresh enough to transfer. She touched the cuff mark gently. He abandoned this vest here because he realized afterward. He never came back for it because coming back meant admitting he'd been here and that this existed. He left the evidence behind, Elias said. He was frightened, Ruth said. Frightened men make mistakes. They abandon things. She looked at Delphine. This vest is material evidence in a case of judicial fraud. If I can get it to Marshal Jonas Webb along with my father's ledger. You can prove Bates made the documents, Delphine said. I can prove Bates handled those documents in Hale's office before they appeared in the courthouse. That places the forgery at Hale's instruction. With my father's written account of Bates coming to him beforehand, the ledger entry, it establishes that Bates had knowledge of the plan, acted on it, and then attempted to distance himself from the evidence. Ruth folded the vest carefully and set it on the counter. It is not everything, but it is the thread. Webb is a man who follows threads. Delphine was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the vest. She looked at Ruth. She looked at Elias with an expression that was measuring something about him that had nothing to do with his physical size. What does this mean for me? She said. It was not a fearful question. It was a practical one. The question of a woman who had survived 12 years in a town owned by one man, by understanding exactly the cost of everything before she committed to it. It means you held property that constitutes evidence in a capital fraud proceeding, Ruth said, unknowingly, which protects you legally. She paused. It also means that when this goes to Webb, and Webb acts, Hale will eventually know that the vest came from here. He will know you cooperated. He'll know I told the truth, Delphine said. Yes. Another silence. Delphine smoothed the brown paper on the counter with one hand, a gesture that had no practical purpose but was the kind of thing hands do when a person is thinking hard about something that matters. My daughter lives in Abilene, she said finally. I have been thinking about Abilene for 2 years. Thinking about what it would take to close this shop and go there. She looked at Ruth. I believe you can fold that vest back into the paper and take it with you. I believe I have a sister in Abilene as well, who I should visit before the summer is out. Ruth held her gaze. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Delphine said. Thank your father for being a man worth telling the truth about. She began rewrapping the vest efficiently. You need to be out of this town before evening. Grath will have told Hale by now. Hale's man Gage, the one he uses for tracking, he came through here last week, asking about a woman with red hair traveling alone. She looked at Ruth. He described you exactly. Gage has been following me since I left Warren's house, Ruth said. He's good at what he does, Delphine said. He doesn't make noise and he doesn't make mistakes. If he's in the county, he already knows you're here. The dollar transaction will have reached him within the hour. She looked at Elias. There's a road south that Hale's men use regular, the one through the Canyon Pass. They'll assume any flight south takes that road because it's the fastest. We're not taking the roads, Elias said. Delphine nodded once. She handed the wrapped package across the counter to Ruth, and Ruth took it and held it against her side under her arm, with the particular grip of someone holding something irreplaceable. One more thing, Ruth said. She reached inside her bodice and produced the small notebook. She opened it and found the page she wanted. She knew exactly which page did not need to search. She turned it toward Delphine. Is that the man who came to my father's house, the one my father wrote about? The man with shaking hands. Delphine read the description my father had written. She took her time. When she looked up, something in her face had resolved into a harder certainty. "I have seen that man," she said. "Not here. On the North Road 6 weeks ago, driving a supply wagon toward Hale's main property at night. I was up late with a fever sitting by my window. He was moving fast for a supply wagon, and he had no lantern, which you only do if you don't want to be seen." She paused. "He had ink on his hands even from that distance. I remember it because it was dark ink on pale hands, and the moonlight caught it." Ruth closed the notebook. She put it back. "That's Bates," she said. "That's enough." They left through the back of the laundry. Delphine showed them the alley that ran behind the block of buildings parallel to the main street, the one that connected to the feed yard behind the livery, the one that allowed a person to move the full length of Sawyer Creek without appearing on the main street at all. She told them this without being asked, which told Elias that Delphine Okafor had known about this alley and its uses for a long time, and for reasons of her own survival. The livery was dim and smelled of hay and horses and the heat that accumulates in enclosed spaces in July. The liveryman was a thin man named Pruitt, who owed Elias 3 months of ironwork credit and who asked no questions when Elias told him he needed 2 horses saddled for a long ride and needed them in the next 10 minutes. Ruth stood near the stall of a chestnut mare, and the mare put her nose toward Ruth's shoulder, and Ruth let her standing still and letting the animal take her measure. "You ride?" Elias said. "My father put me on a horse before I could walk on my own," she said. "Yes." "It's going to be rough country," he said. "The creek bed section is dry this time of year, which makes the footing unpredictable. Loose shale under a clay surface." "I've ridden worse," she said, and the way she said it made him believe her without needing details. He was cinching the saddle on the second horse when she spoke again. "Why did you come out of the forge?" she said. "He kept working. I told you. I saw the rope." "Men see things in this town every day," she said. "They see things, and they calculate, and they go back inside. You didn't calculate. You walked out before I was through the front of my mind." He pulled the strap through the buckle and checked the tension. "I had a wife," he said. "Margaret." He stopped. He did not often say her name, and the 2 syllables sat in the stable air between them for a moment, with more weight than 2 syllables should carry. "She died last winter. We were in a bad situation because of what Hale had done to my family's land. No money for proper provisions. No money for a doctor when she needed one." He checked the bridle with his hands, not looking at it. "I have walked past things I should not have walked past. I have kept my head down and my mouth shut for 3 years, telling myself it was practical. That morning I looked at that rope and I did not feel practical." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The mare shifted under her hand. "I'm sorry about Margaret," she said. "I know you are," he said. He said it simply without deflection, which surprised her. Most men, when offered condolence, either dismissed it or drowned in it. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, straight on without performance. "She would have understood what you're doing," Ruth said. He looked at her then. "How do you know that?" "Because you understood it," she said. "And people teach each other things." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he moved to the horse and checked the left stirrup, and did not say anything else, and she did not push it. That was the right choice, to let a true thing rest in the air, rather than turning it over, until the shine came off it. Pruitt came back with the saddlebags Elias had asked for 2 days of provisions, water, his rifle in the scabbard on his saddle. Ruth put the wrapped package from Delphine into the left saddlebag, and settled the bag's flap over it with care. They led the horses out through the back of the livery into the alley. The sky overhead was still that hard summer blue, the sun dropping toward afternoon, but still high enough to mean serious heat for another 3 hours at least. "Grath is going to tell Hale you took me," Ruth said as they moved through the alley. "Grath is going to tell Hale I paid $1 for a legal transfer of custodial obligation," Elias said. "Which is true. What I do with that obligation is my business. Hale will assume I handed you over to someone or let you go. He won't think." He paused. "A broke blacksmith, who can barely pay his feed bill taking off south on 2 horses to reach Jonas Webb, is not the first story anyone in this town would construct about me." "They don't know you very well," she said. "No," he said. "They don't." At the end of the alley where the buildings gave out and the flat, open ground of the cattle yards began, Ruth stopped and looked back once at the main street of Sawyer Creek visible in the gap between the last 2 buildings. A strip of it, the dust, the boardwalk, the front of the general store with its sign hanging crooked on one hinge. Ordinary. Completely ordinary, the way places always look from the outside when the damage is happening on the inside. "My father walked that street every day for 14 years, she said. "He thought it knew him." "It did," Elias said. "It just wasn't paying attention when it mattered." She turned away from it and mounted the chestnut mare in a single clean motion and did not look back again. Elias mounted his own horse, and they moved east across the cattle yards toward the dry creek bed that would take them south away from the roads, away from Hale's men who would be riding those roads by nightfall, away from Sawyer Creek, and everything it had done to both of them by the slow and patient machinery of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to ruin a life. Behind them in the laundry at the end of the block, Delphine Okafor was already packing the things she would need for Abilene. And in the saloon, 2 doors from the livery, Lon Grath had finished his second glass and was reaching for the third, and wondering whether what he had to tell Douglas Hale was going to be received the way he hoped or the way he feared, and understanding somewhere in the part of him that had not yet been entirely deadened by 6 years of Hale's employ, that the answer to that question was going to depend on things that had already moved beyond his ability to control them. The horses moved into the dry creek bed, and the town fell away behind the rise of the bank and was gone. They rode for 3 hours before either of them spoke about anything that mattered. The dry creek bed took them south in long, shallow curves, the shale cracking under the horses' hooves in the particular way of summer-baked ground that has not seen water in months. The heat came off the earth as much as from the sky, a flat pressing heat that had no drama to it. Just wait. Ruth rode slightly ahead when the creek bed widened, and slightly behind when it narrowed, adjusting without instruction, reading the terrain, the way someone reads a familiar text, not thinking about it, just moving with it. Elias watched her without appearing to. Old habit. The Pinkerton years had built in him a way of observing that operated underneath the surface of whatever else he was doing, a second layer of attention that cataloged and filed without interrupting the primary business of the moment. What he cataloged about Ruth McAllister in those 3 hours was this: she did not fidget. She did not fill silence with noise. She checked behind them at regular intervals, every 12 minutes or so, consistent as a clock without making a performance of it. And she held the left saddlebag with the wrapped package in it against her leg, with the subtle, steady pressure of a person keeping contact with the most important thing. It was past mid-afternoon when the creek bed bent east, and Elias signaled them to stop at a limestone outcrop that threw shade across a stretch of flat ground. "Water the horses," he said. 15 minutes. They dismounted. Ruth took her canteen and walked to a spot 10 feet from the horses and stood with her back to the outcrop, not to Elias, but to the open ground to the south, watching the distance. He noticed that too. She had naturally taken the position that covered the direction they were heading. He had taken the direction they'd come from, without consciously deciding, to which meant they had divided the watch without speaking a word about it. He found that interesting in the way that only truly practical things are interesting. "Tell me about Gage," he said. She turned her head slightly but kept her eyes south. "What do you want to know? Everything you know about how he works." She considered that for a moment. He was a cavalry tracker before Hale hired him. 7 years in the territories following deserters and horse thieves. He doesn't rush. That's the main thing. Most men, when they're hunting someone, they move fast because speed makes them feel like they're doing something. Gage moves slow and sure, and he doesn't care how long it takes because Douglas Hale pays him whether it takes 2 days or 2 weeks. She paused. He found a woman outside of Lubbock last spring who had been running for 6 weeks. He followed her across 3 counties without her knowing he was behind her, and he walked up to her front door in the town she thought was safe, and knocked like a neighbor coming to call. You know about that woman? She was the wife of a man Hale wanted silenced. She had documents similar to what I have. Ruth's voice stayed even. She did not reach anyone who could act on them. The implications settled between them without needing to be stated. He'll know we left town, Elias said. Grath will have told Hale within an hour of us leaving the livery. Hale will send men on the South Road and the Canyon Pass Road. Those are the logical routes. He'll send Gage separately because Gage doesn't travel with other men, they slow him down, and they make noise. So we have two problems, Ruth said. The men on the roads and Gage behind us. The men on the roads we can avoid. The creek bed buys us tonight and most of tomorrow morning before we need to cut east toward Barrow. By the time we need to cross open ground, we'll be far enough south that their search pattern will have moved past us. He looked at the distance behind them. Gage is the problem I haven't solved yet. Ruth was quiet for a moment. He will look for where we left town. He'll find the livery and he'll find Pruitt. Pruitt won't say anything. Pruitt won't need to. Gage doesn't ask questions the way other men do. He reads what's already there. She turned to face Elias directly now. He'll find our tracks in the cattle yard within an hour of arriving in town. By tomorrow morning, he will know we're in the creek bed. The question is whether he knows about the Casado route. He might, Elias said honestly. He's worked this county long enough. Then we cannot assume the route keeps us hidden all the way to Barrow. No, he said. She took a long drink from her canteen and capped it and looked at it in her hands. My father used to say that the difference between a bad situation and a fatal one is whether you understand the situation clearly before it becomes the fatal version. She looked up. I am trying to understand this situation clearly. So am I, Elias said. Then tell me what you're not saying. He looked at her. She looked back with the gray eyes that had been reading him since the forge, and had apparently been doing it more accurately than he had realized. There's a ranch, he said, 11 miles east of the creek bed. Man named Tom Aldridge. He's been fighting Hale's water rights claims for 4 years on his own, which is either stupidity or the kind of courage that looks like stupidity from the outside. He has a telegraph. He paused. If I can reach Aldridge and get a message to Webb before Gage pins down our location, Webb can ride to meet us instead of us riding to find him. Cuts 2 days off the journey. Maybe enough. Why didn't you say that before? Because going to Aldridge means leaving the creekbed route and cutting east earlier than planned. It means open ground for 6 miles in daylight. It means anyone watching the eastern approach to his property sees 2 riders coming from a direction that doesn't have a natural explanation. He held her gaze. It's a risk that might solve the problem or might accelerate it. I wanted to be further south before I offered it. How far south are we now? Far enough, he said. If we move in the next 10 minutes. She was already moving toward her horse. They left the creek bed at a wide, shallow spot where the bank had eroded flat, and the horses crossed onto level ground without breaking stride. The land here was open cattle country dry grass, the occasional mesquite, throwing a thin shadow the ground hard and pale as a road, even where no road had been built. Ruth rode beside Elias now, the saddlebags balanced across her horse's haunches, the wrapped vest pressing gently against her right leg each time the mare's gait shifted. She had been thinking about Bates for the last 3 hours. Not about what he had done she had processed that long ago in her father's empty office the night she found the ledger in the long, sleepless weeks after. She was thinking about what he was going to do now. Because Bates was the weakest point in Hale's architecture, and weak points when they felt pressure coming, either collapsed inward or ran. Bates will know something's wrong, she said. Elias glanced at her. What makes you say that now? Because Gage went through Sawyer Creek last week asking about me. Hale doesn't use Gage for simple domestic disputes. A husband reporting an unstable wife is courthouse paperwork, not tracker work. Hale sent Gage because he knows what I have. And if Hale knows what I have, he's been thinking about who else might be a thread that pulls loose. She kept her eyes moving across the open ground as she talked. Bates hasn't collected his vest in 5 weeks. That means he already knows he left something behind. He's been avoiding the laundry. He's frightened. And he's been frightened for weeks. And a frightened man who knows Hale is tightening his operation. Either stays put and prays or runs, Elias said. If he runs and Hale finds him first. There goes your corroboration, Elias said. She nodded. The ledger places Bates at my father's house. The vest places Bates at Hale's office with fresh ink on his hands. But if Bates disappears, if he goes to California, or if Hale decides he's more useful silent, then we have circumstantial evidence and a dead man's notebook against one of the most powerful landowners in Texas. Webb has worked with less, Elias said. Has he won with less? A pause. Not always. She absorbed that without flinching. He appreciated that about her, that she wanted the honest answer, even when it was the harder one. They were 3 miles from Aldridge's property when Elias held up his hand, and they stopped. He had heard something. Not a sound, exactly the absence of a sound that should have been there. The usual scatter of birds from the grass ahead of 2 riders had not happened. The ground ahead was quiet in a way that was not natural quiet. Ruth had stopped her horse the moment his hand went up. She didn't ask what. She listened. 60 seconds passed. Then, from the mesquite line, 200 yards to the east, a rider emerged at a walk. Alone. Coming at an angle that was not quite toward them, and not quite away the deliberate approach of someone who wants to be seen before they get close enough to create alarm. Elias's hand moved to the rifle in the scabbard on instinct, and then stopped. The rider raised one hand palm out. The gesture of someone announcing peaceful intent, and the horse beneath him, a gray with 3 white stockings, was a horse Elias recognized. "That's Tom Aldridge," he said. Ruth's breath came out slowly. She had been holding it. Aldridge rode up and stopped his horse 6 feet away. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had spent those years outdoors, burned brown lean with a white mustache and eyes that were the faded blue of sky in August. He looked at Elias and then at Ruth, and then at the saddlebags, and then back at Elias, with the expression of a man completing a calculation. "Figured it might be you," Aldridge said to Elias. "Saw 2 riders coming south in the creek bed from the ridge this morning. Didn't know who, but I knew it wasn't Hale's people, because Hale's people ride in groups and make noise." He looked at Ruth. "You're McAllister's girl." "Yes, sir," Ruth said. "Your father ruled in my favor on the water rights case 2 years ago," Aldridge said, "before they took his bench. Was the last honest ruling this county saw from a judge." He looked at Elias again. "Grath came through here an hour ago on the South Road. Wasn't looking for anything specific, just looking, which means Hale sent him to look." "We need your telegraph," Elias said. "I know you do," Aldridge said. "That's why I came to find you instead of waiting for you to find me. Come on." He turned his horse and they followed him east toward the ranch, and there was something in the simple directness of the old man's action. No negotiation, no calculation of cost, just the immediate practical movement toward what needed to happen that made Elias's chest feel something it hadn't felt in a while. The specific warmth of a person doing the right thing without making a ceremony of it. The ranch house was low and long with a covered porch along the front and a windmill that was turning slowly in the hot afternoon air. An old woman appeared in the doorway as they rode up Aldridge's wife, gray-haired and sharp-faced, who looked at Ruth with the same immediate recognition her husband had shown, and said, "Get inside, girl, before somebody on that road sees you standing in my yard." Inside the house, it was cooler and dark after the bright outdoor heat. Ruth set the saddlebags on the table when the old woman, her name was Clara Aldridge, which was a fact that landed on Elias with a quiet weight that he set aside without examining, directed her to, and Ruth opened the left bag and took out the brown paper package and set it beside the saddlebag with the particular care she always gave it. The telegraph was in the back room next to the kitchen, a practical installation that Aldridge had paid to have run 3 years ago when the distances in his operation got too large to manage by rider alone. He sat down at it without preamble. "What do you need to say to Webb?" he said to Ruth. Ruth stood beside him and thought for 10 seconds, the focused silence of someone composing exactly the right words in exactly the right order. Then she said, "Message to Marshal Jonas Webb from Ruth McAllister. Have material evidence in Hale forgery case, including documented witness account, physical trace evidence, and original source ledger, currently in transit. Need urgent meeting. Trust the sender of this message." Aldridge looked at her. That last part. "Webb knows Elias Cole," Ruth said. "He needs to know who vouches for this." Aldridge looked at Elias. Elias nodded. Aldridge sent the message. They waited. Clara Aldridge put food on the table without being asked, cold biscuits and dried beef and water from the well. And Ruth ate the way she had eaten in the forge, controlled and efficient. And Elias noticed she gave half her biscuit to the plate quietly when she thought no one was looking. Clara Aldridge noticed too. She put another biscuit on Ruth's plate without comment. The telegraph clicked 20 minutes later. Aldridge read the incoming message with the slow care of a man who was not a fast reader, but was an accurate one. "Webb says he's been waiting on something to move in the Hale matter for 8 months, Aldridge read aloud. "He says he'll ride north from Barrow tonight. He says to meet him at the Casado crossing the old survey marker by noon tomorrow." He looked up. "He says tell Cole I know about the Cole land file. Tell him I said the note was altered after signing. Tell him I've known that for 3 years, and couldn't move without something to anchor it." Elias sat very still. Ruth looked at him. "He knew," Elias said. It came out quieter than he intended, the sound of something that had been a wound and was becoming something else, not healed, but different in the way a thing is different when it finally has a name. "He knew, and he needed what you have," Ruth said carefully. "He needed what you have," Elias said. "The ledger. The vest. Bates. And you needed to be the one to bring it to him," she said. "Because he trusts you in a way he can't trust most men. Because 3 years ago when your father's land was taken, you could have gone to Webb with the altered note and made accusations, and he would have had nothing to act on, and you would have been another angry man with a grievance." She met his eyes. "You had to wait for the evidence to exist, Elias. That's not a failure. That's the situation." He looked at the table. At the biscuit on the plate in front of him, and the tin cup of water beside it, and the ordinary objects of someone's ordinary kitchen that had become, in the last hour, the location of something that was not ordinary at all. "My father waited 4 years, he said. He died waiting." "I know," she said. "My wife." He stopped. He put his hand flat on the table. "Margaret died in January, the baby in December. If I had been able to move sooner. If Webb had been able to move 3 years ago." "You cannot carry that arithmetic," Ruth said. Her voice was not soft exactly. It was direct in the specific way that is more comforting than soft, because it refuses to dress the truth up in something it isn't. "I have tried to carry that kind of arithmetic about my father. What if I had found the ledger sooner? What if I had understood what Bates was telling him sooner? What if I had run before Warren had the mechanism in place to call me unstable?" She shook her head. "That arithmetic doesn't have a bottom. You fall through it and keep falling, and it doesn't bring anyone back." He looked at her. "What it does," she said, "is make you too heavy to move. And tomorrow morning, we need to move." Tom Aldridge had been sitting at the telegraph desk, pretending to occupy himself with something on the wall and doing a poor job of it. He cleared his throat now. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Both of you. I'll put the horses in the back barn, where they can't be seen from the road. Clara can take the girl's eye and do something useful with it." He looked at Elias with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing whether it was wise. "I've been watching what Hale does to this county for 6 years, Cole. I am tired of watching." Elias looked at the old man. "It's not without risk to you." "I know what it is," Aldridge said. I've been living with Hale's risk for 6 years anyway. At least this time I'm doing something with it." He stood and pushed back his chair. "Eat your biscuit. You look like a man who hasn't stopped moving long enough to eat since morning." He was not wrong. Clara Aldridge took Ruth to the back room with a bowl of cold water and clean cloth, and did something efficient and no-nonsense with the swollen eye that Ruth accepted without protest. Elias heard Clara's voice through the wall. Not the words, just the tone, the particular tone of an older woman speaking to a younger one in trouble, matter-of-fact and capable, which was its own kind of kindness. He sat at the table after Aldridge had gone out to the barn and looked at the brown paper package Ruth had set on the table. The vest inside it. The ink mark on the cuff that Delphine had kept without knowing she was keeping it. The ledger pressed against Ruth's ribs for 14 days of running. He thought about Webb riding north tonight through the summer dark toward the Casado crossing. He thought about a gray horse and 3 white stockings appearing from the mesquite line, and an old man raising one hand. He thought about Margaret in the bad winter, in the thin walls of the rented room above the hardware store, looking at him with eyes that never blamed him, and never stopped loving him, and never once said that any of it was his fault, even though some of it was, and they both knew it. He reached into his chest pocket and felt the small, hard shape of the thimble there. Silver. Room temperature, now the same temperature as his body, as though it had always been there. He left it where it was. He did not take it out. But he held it through the fabric for a moment, the way a man holds something he is not yet ready to put down, but is beginning to understand that he will someday be able to. Outside, the sun was going down behind the low hills to the west, and the heat was finally slowly beginning to lift off the ground the way heat lifts when it has nowhere left to go. The windmill turned against the last of the light. Tom Aldridge moved between the barn and the house with the unhurried purpose of a man who has always done what needed doing and has never required applause for it. And somewhere behind them on a road or off of it, moving patient and sure through the fading Texas afternoon, Gage was still coming. Elias woke before the house did. That was nothing new. He had been waking before everything else for 3 years, before the birds, before the light, before the particular quality of silence that meant the world was still asleep and he was not. He lay on the floor of Tom Aldridge's front room with his jacket folded under his head and his rifle within arm's reach, and he listened to the house breathe around him, and he knew before he was fully conscious of knowing it that something outside had changed. Not a sound. The absence of one. The windmill had stopped. There was enough wind tonight to turn it. He had fallen asleep to the sound of it, the slow rhythmic creak of the blades, and now it was still. Which meant something between the wind and the mill had intervened. Something with mass. Something that had moved close enough to the mill's post to block the draw of air through the blades. He was on his feet before the thought completed itself. He crossed to the window in 2 steps and looked out through the gap in the curtain without moving the curtain. The yard was dark, the moon behind cloud cover, the outlines of the barn and the fence posts barely visible. Nothing moved. But the windmill was still. Behind him, the door to the back room opened, and Ruth stood in the doorframe. She had not been asleep either. He could tell from the way she was standing fully upright, no stiffness of someone just woken, both hands free, the notebook already tucked inside her bodice and the saddlebag over her left shoulder. "The windmill," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "How long ago did it stop?" "Can't be more than 2 minutes. I heard it when I fell asleep." She moved to the other side of the window and looked out from that angle. They were quiet together for 30 seconds. Then she said, "He's at the barn." Elias looked at her. "The horses," she said. "If I were Gage and I arrived at this property in the dark, I would go to the barn first. Confirm the horses are here before I approach the house. Confirm I have the right location before I commit." She paused. "He's not going to come in shooting. That's not how he works. He'll wait for us to come out in the morning and take us on the road where it looks like a legal transfer of custody." "Then we don't go out in the morning the way he expects us to," Elias said. He moved to the back of the house and knocked twice on Tom Aldridge's bedroom door, the knock of a man who needs a response immediately, but is not willing to create the noise of urgency. Aldridge opened the door in 12 seconds, which meant he had not been deeply asleep either. He was already dressed. "Gage is outside," Elias said. "At the barn." Aldridge's face did not show fear. It showed something more useful, the focused calm of a man arriving at a situation he had been half expecting and had thought about before it arrived. How certain. Certain enough. "Clara's with me. She won't make noise." Aldridge pulled the door mostly closed. "What do you need?" Elias thought for 3 seconds. "Your south fence gate. Does it open without sound?" "I oiled it 2 weeks ago," Aldridge said. "Force of habit. We need to be gone before he leaves the barn. If he's waiting for morning, he'll settle in for the next 3 hours. That's our window." He looked at Aldridge directly. "I need you to stay inside. Don't go to the barn before sunrise, regardless of what you hear. You haven't done anything except offer hospitality to travelers, and you need to be able to say that honestly." Aldridge looked at him. "I sent a telegraph to Jonas Webb." "For ranch business," Elias said. "Routine communication. You don't know what it was about." He held the old man's gaze. "You have been fighting Hale for 6 years. You cannot lose this ranch. Don't give him a reason." Something moved through Aldridge's expression, the particular frustration of a man who wants to do more than he is being permitted to do, checked against the knowledge that the constraint is right. He put his hand briefly on Elias's shoulder. One grip. Then he stepped back and closed the door. Ruth was already at the back of the house with both saddlebags. She had moved through the dark kitchen without a lamp and had found everything with the quiet efficiency that had characterized everything she did. She handed Elias his jacket, the one with the deep interior pockets, and he put it on and picked up his rifle. "We go out the kitchen door and follow the garden fence to the south gate," he said, his voice barely above breath. "Don't rush. Rushing makes noise. We move the way the ground moves, slow and continuous." She nodded once. They went out the kitchen door into the dark summer night, and the heat was still there less than the day, but present the Texas July that released the temperature slowly and grudgingly, as though the air resented giving it up. The ground was hard under their feet, and Elias was grateful for that soft ground held footsteps, and soft ground could be read by morning. The garden fence was low, and the path along it was clear. Elias moved along it with one hand, lightly grazing the fence posts, counting them. He had counted them, coming in 10 posts to the south gate. Another old habit from the years of moving through dark buildings where the exits needed to be memorized on arrival. Ruth moved behind him without touching him and without losing him in the dark, tracking his movement by sound in the specific way of someone who had learned to navigate without the luxury of light. 8 posts. 9. 10. The gate. He lifted the latch with 2 fingers and eased it open, and it moved without sound. Aldridge had not been wrong about the oil. They were through. The horses were the problem he had been holding in the back of his mind since he left the window. The horses were in the barn. Gage was at the barn. Taking the horses meant walking directly toward the man who was hunting them, and leaving the horses meant 11 miles to the Casado crossing on foot in the dark, which was not impossible, but would put them at the meeting point hours past noon, and Webb would not wait indefinitely. "Leave them," Ruth said quietly, as though she had followed his thinking to the same place. "It's 11 miles. "I know how far it is," she said. "We leave now. We walk hard. We reach the crossing by mid-morning. If we try for the horses and Gage is in that barn—" "I know," he said. "The evidence is here." She pressed her hand briefly against her side where the notebook sat. "The vest is here." She touched the saddlebag. "We are here. Gage without us is a man standing in an empty barn. Gage with us in custody is the end of everything." She was right. She had been right about most things since the forge, and he had learned in the last 24 hours to recognize when she was reasoning from evidence and when she was reasoning from feeling, and this was the former. They moved south into the open dark. They walked for 2 hours without speaking, except for the necessary things: a change in the ground, a sound that needed a moment of attention, the decision at the junction of two dry washes to take the eastern branch. Ruth set the pace, and Elias let her matching it, because her pace was exactly what it needed to be, steady enough to cover ground, controlled enough to sustain. She had walked before. A lot. A person learns that gait or they don't, and she had. The moon came out from behind the cloud cover around the second hour, and the ground opened up in the pale light and became navigable in a way it hadn't been. Ruth looked at it for a moment. The long, flat reach of the land ahead. The dark line of the Casado Creek bed visible a mile to the south. "My father used to take me riding at night when I was small," she said. Her voice was conversational, but quiet, the register of someone saying a true thing in the space that is opened up between harder things. He said night riding was something a person should know. He said the dark is not more dangerous than the day, it's just different, and different is only frightening, until you understand the rules. "He sounds like a man who thought about things carefully," Elias said. "He thought about everything carefully," she said. "That was his nature. He could not do anything carelessly. It was a quality that made him a very good judge, and a very—" She paused. It made certain things in his life difficult. He could not accept the world as it was, when he could see clearly what it should be. "That kind of man has a hard time," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "He does, but the world is better for him having been in it." She said it simply, without sentimentality, just the statement of a true accounting. "I used to be angry at him for dying, for letting what Hale did to his reputation be the thing that finished him. I thought he should have fought harder, stayed longer." She looked ahead. "I understand now that he fought the only way he knew how, by recording everything, by keeping the ledger, by refusing to stop believing that the truth written down was worth something, even when no one was reading it." She touched her side where the notebook was. "He was right." "He trusted you to find it," Elias said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The false bottom. He put it in the desk he knew you would go through, the one he knew you knew." He kept his eyes on the ground ahead. A man who wanted to hide something would have put it somewhere no one would look. A man who wanted to pass something on put it somewhere the right person would find it. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed by a small but specific degree, the way a thing changes when it settles into a new understanding. "I never thought of it that way." "He knew who you were," Elias said. "He trusted that." She did not respond to that, but she straightened slightly as she walked, some weight shifting in her posture, not lessening exactly, but redistributing, finding a new balance. They reached the Casado crossing at mid-morning, the sun already serious overhead, the dry creek bed at the survey marker exactly as Aldridge had described it, a square stone post, half sunk into the ground with the territorial surveyor's mark cut into the face, worn, but legible. Webb was not there yet. They found shade on the south bank and sat with their backs against the bank's cut face, and drank from the canteens that were at 3/4 now, and waited. Ruth took the vest from the saddlebag and opened the brown paper and looked at the cuff mark again in the morning light. She had looked at it 3 times during the journey. Not obsessively each time, with new purpose, as though she were continuing a process of preparation, building the sequence of how she would present it, how she would explain it, how she would walk Webb through the chain of reasoning in the exact order that would make each link visible. "When Webb arrives," she said, "let me speak first." "All right," Elias said. "Not because you can't." "I know," he said. "It's your case. You should present it." She looked at him. He had surprised her again. She was not used to men understanding a thing like that without requiring an explanation. "Thank you," she said. "Your father would have done the same thing," he said. "Let the person with the most complete picture present it." She rewrapped the vest and folded her hands over the package in her lap and was quiet for a moment. Then, "What will you do after this, when it's resolved?" He looked at the survey marker. "There's land," he said. My father's 40 acres on the South Fork. If Webb can act on what Hale did, if Bates can be pressured enough to cooperate, if the documentation holds, the amended deed can be challenged, the original terms restored." He paused. "Lands sat fallow for 3 years. It needs work. Will you go back to it?" "It's the only land my father ever owned," Elias said. "It's where my family is buried." He said it without drama, just the plain fact of it. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "It's a good reason to go back somewhere," she said. "Not to escape something, to build something." He looked at her. She was looking at the survey marker, turning something over in her own mind, and he let her turn it over without interrupting. They heard the horse before they saw it. One horse moving at a steady trot on the south approach, coming without stealth, because it was not coming from behind them, but from directly south along the agreed route. Webb riding north, as his message had said. Jonas Webb was bigger than Elias remembered, or perhaps he had simply put on the weight of the last 3 years, along with everything else. He was 60, gray-bearded, heavy in the saddle, in the way of large men who have ridden long enough that the horse has shaped itself around them. He wore a marshal's badge that had been polished recently, which Elias noticed and understood. A man who polishes his badge before a meeting is a man who wants the meeting to be taken seriously. He pulled up at the crossing and looked at them both, and then at the saddlebag, and the package, and the notebook that Ruth had laid out on the flat ground beside the survey marker as he approached, arranged in the order she would present them. "You walked from Aldridge's," he said to Elias. It was not a question. "Left our horses," Elias said. "Gage was at the barn." Webb's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Gage got here fast." He dismounted and dropped his reins, and the horse stood. He looked at Ruth. "You're the judge's daughter." "Yes, sir," Ruth said. She was standing now straight, the same posture she had held in every room since the forge, not performing confidence, but not apologizing for it either. "I knew your father," Webb said. "He was the most honest man in the county, and what happened to him was a wrong that this territory owes a debt on." He said it simply, plainly, the way he apparently said everything. Then, "Show me what you have." She showed him. She did it in the order she had prepared, moving through each piece with the precise sequential logic of someone who has organized information for presentation to a skeptical audience and knows that the sequence matters as much as the content. The ledger first, her father's account of Bates coming to his home, the date, the shaking hands, the specific request Hale had made through Bates regarding the amended deeds. Webb read every page she indicated, slowly going back twice to reread. Then the vest. She laid it in front of him and turned the cuff to the light and explained the ink, the color, the single source in the county, the location of that source in Hale's building. She told him about Delphine. She told him exactly what Delphine had seen on the North Road at night, the man with ink on his hands, the wagon without a lantern, the date and the direction. Webb listened without interrupting. Then she placed her own written statement beside the ledger, 4 pages she had written at Aldridge's kitchen table in the hour before she slept, in the careful, precise handwriting that matched everything else about how she operated, describing the forged documents, the color of the ink. She had observed the specific characteristics that identified them as forgeries rather than inventions, and the timeline from her father's removal to her marriage to Warren Tilden, to the night she found the false bottom in the desk. Webb read all of it. He did not rush. He went back to the ledger twice more. He picked up the vest and examined the cuff in the light and set it down and looked at it from a slight distance and picked it up again. When he finished, he was quiet for a full minute. "Bates is the pin," he said finally. "Yes," Ruth said. "If Bates runs, or if Hale moves him before I can take a formal statement, the chain weakens." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why I needed to reach you before Hale knew what I was carrying. He knows I'm running. He knows I left Warren's house with something. But he doesn't know what specifically. He doesn't know about Delphine. He doesn't know about the ink." "He knows about the ledger," Webb said. "He knew your father kept notes. It's the thing that would have worried him most." Then, we need to move on Bates today, Ruth said. She said it directly without hedging, without the performance of deference that women in her position were generally expected to perform when telling a territorial marshal what needed to happen. Before Hale decides that Bates is more dangerous alive than managed. Webb looked at her for a long moment. You understand that even with all of this, a proceeding against Douglas Hale in this territory is going to be contested at every level. His lawyers will challenge the chain of custody on the vest. They will question the admissibility of your father's private ledger. They will build a case around your instability petition. The petition isn't signed, Ruth said. It will be by tomorrow. Then move on Warren Tilden before it can be signed, she said. The instability petition is a legal document filed with fraudulent intent to suppress a material witness. If you move on Tilden as a party to the fraud, as an instrument of Hale's effort to silence me, the petition becomes evidence against them rather than against me. Webb looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. He simply looked back at Webb with the expression of a man who has been watching something unfold exactly the way he expected it to. She worked this out on the road, Webb said. She worked it out before she left the house, Elias said. Webb looked back at Ruth. Something in his face had moved from assessment into a different category, not approval exactly, which would have had the condescension of surprise in it, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has been looking for a specific kind of evidence and has found it in an unexpected form. I need you to repeat everything you just told me in a sworn statement, he said. Formal witness entered into the territorial record today. I'm ready, she said. I have the paperwork on my horse, Webb said. He turned toward his horse and then stopped. He looked at Elias. The coal land file. The note alteration. I want you to know. You couldn't move without an anchor, Elias said. I know. Your father was owed better than what he got, Webb said. So was your wife. Elias looked at the survey marker. The territorial seal cut into its face, worn by weather still legible, still standing. Then let's make it mean something, he said. Webb nodded and went to his horse for the paperwork, and Ruth sat down at the flat ground beside the survey marker and smoothed the first page against the hard, dry earth and picked up the pen Webb handed her and began to write. The sun was overhead and the heat was complete and absolute, and somewhere behind them to the north, Gage was still in Tom Aldridge's barn or on the road south following tracks or recalculating his approach, and Douglas Hale was in his office or at his table, or in whatever room powerful men occupy when they believe the machinery they have built is still running correctly. He did not yet know that Ruth McAllister was sitting at the Casado crossing with her father's ledger open in her lap and Jonas Webb's pen in her hand, and the particular focused stillness of a woman who has been moving toward this moment for 2 years and has finally arrived at it. He did not yet know that the machinery had already changed. But he would. Ruth finished the sworn statement in 40 minutes. Webb read it through twice, signed it as witnessing officer, dated it, and folded it into the leather document case he carried in his saddlebag. He handled it with the deliberate care of a man who understands that paper in the right hands is the most durable weapon in existence. I'm riding for Sawyer Creek directly, he said. He was already cinching his saddle. Bates first. I want him in a room with that vest and that ledger entry before he has any warning that this is moving. A frightened man who doesn't know the net is closed will talk to buy himself room. A frightened man who's had time to think will lawyer himself into silence. He looked at Ruth. You and Cole stay off the main road until I send word. I'll telegraph Aldridge when Bates is in custody. And Warren, Ruth said. Warren Tilden will be served with a material witness obstruction notice before nightfall, Webb said. The instability petition dies with it. No judge in this territory will sign a psychiatric certificate for a woman who is simultaneously a named witness in a federal fraud proceeding. He paused. That's not justice. That's procedure. But procedure is what we have, and we use it. I understand the difference, Ruth said. Webb looked at her one final time with the expression he had worn since she finished her presentation, Not warmth exactly, but the solid, plain regard of a man who has recalibrated what he thought he was riding to meet versus what he actually found. "Your father would be proud of how you carried this," he said. He said it, and he meant it, and he did not wait for her response, because it was not a thing that needed a response. He mounted and rode south, and within 2 minutes, the sound of his horse was gone into the flat distance. Ruth stood at the survey marker and looked at the direction he had gone. She stayed that way for a long moment without speaking. Elias stood beside her and let her have the moment the same way she had let him have his moments throughout the journey, without commentary, without intrusion, with the simple presence of another person who understood that some things needed to be stood inside for a moment before a person could move on from them. "It's not finished," she said finally. "No," Elias agreed. "Hale has lawyers, and he has money, and he has 12 years of arrangements with men who owe him. Webb can put Bates in a room and get his testimony. The vest goes into evidence. The ledger goes into evidence. And Hale's lawyers will contest every piece of it." "They will," Elias said. "He may reduce the charges. He may find a sympathetic court." "He may," Elias said. "But he cannot put that ledger back in the desk. He cannot put the ink back on Bates's wrist. He cannot unread what Webb just read." He looked at her. "The architecture he built around himself has a crack in it now. Cracks don't heal in buildings like that. They spread." She turned to look at him. The morning light was full on her face, and her gray eyes were clear, and the swollen eye had reduced overnight with Clara Aldridge's attention to the point where it was a bruise now, rather than an injury. And her expression was the expression of a woman who has been through something long and hard and has come out the other side, not unscathed, but unbroken. "We need to walk back to Aldridge's," she said. "We do. That's 11 miles. It was 11 miles this morning, too," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. But the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was adjacent to it, and it was the first time he had seen her face do anything close to that, and it changed something in the atmosphere between them by a small but specific degree. They walked. The return was different from the night journey, in the way that all returns are different. The direction reversed, but the terrain, the same familiar now. The ground that had been unknown in the dark, legible in the morning light. Ruth walked beside him rather than behind matching stride. The saddlebag was lighter now, without the brown paper package which was in Webb's document case on its way south, and that lightness seemed to affect more than just her shoulder. She talked more on the return. Not loosely, she was never loose with words, but the valve that had been held at minimum pressure for the duration of the journey opened slightly, and what came through was the Ruth McAllister that existed underneath the Ruth McAllister who had been running for 14 days. She talked about her father's courtroom, the way he had presided, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the quiet authority of a man who had read every relevant statute and precedent and knew that genuine knowledge was the only authority worth having. She talked about sitting in the back of that courtroom as a girl watching him work, understanding something she couldn't have named then, but could name now, that the law at its best was not about power, but about the precise, careful protection of people who had less of it. That's what he was trying to do, she said. Every case, every ruling. He wasn't performing justice, he was practicing it. The way a doctor practices medicine, imperfect, incremental, but real. And Hale took that from him, Elias said. Hale took the bench, she said. He couldn't take what my father knew or what he'd done with it. The ledger existed. 14 years of careful observation existed. It was all still there in a false-bottomed drawer waiting for someone who could read it the right way. She paused. I used to think my father was defeated. I think now he was patient. They were 2 miles from Aldridge's when they saw the rider. He was coming toward them from the north, which was wrong. Everything coming at them from the north had been wrong since Sawyer Creek, and the body understood that even before the mind caught up. Elias put his hand out, and Ruth stopped beside him without a word. The rider was moving at a controlled pace. One horse, not rushing. Coming straight down the same path they were on, which meant he had found the path, which meant he had followed it from somewhere. "Gage," Ruth said quietly. "Yes," Elias said. His rifle was on his back. He did not reach for it. He had not reached for it once in this entire journey, and he was not going to start now, and not because Gage didn't deserve whatever the worst version of this moment could produce, but because Ruth had worked 14 days for a proceeding that told the truth cleanly, and a shooting on the South Fork of the Casado Creek was not a clean truth. It was a story that got told over the real story, and eventually replaced it. Gage rode up and stopped 15 feet away. He was exactly what Ruth had described a man who moved without waste, and looked at everything with the flat professional assessment of someone for whom other people are primarily variables to be solved. He had a rifle across his saddle and a pistol on his hip, and he made no move toward either. He looked at them. He looked at the saddlebag on Ruth's shoulder, which no longer contained the package that had been in it. He looked at the direction they had come from, south, the direction of the Casado crossing, and he looked at the direction they were heading north back toward Aldridge's. He was reading it. Elias could see him reading it. "You met someone at the crossing," Gage said. It was not a question. "We did," Elias said. "Webb." "Yes." Gage was quiet for a moment. "You gave him what she was carrying." "We gave him a sworn statement," Ruth said. "And material evidence in a capital fraud case. Signed, witnessed, and entered into the territorial record as of this morning." Gage looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, in the way of someone who has been told something that changes the parameters of his current assignment and is running the recalculation in real time. He was not a man who showed much on his face, but what moved through it now was something she had not expected, not anger, not the hardening of a professional who has been beaten to the objective. It was something closer to relief. The expression was gone in an instant, replaced by the flat professional surface. But she had seen it, and she trusted what she saw. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "McAllister," she said. "Ruth McAllister." Something shifted in his jaw. "Mrs. McAllister, Douglas Hale sent me to retrieve you and return you to the custody of your husband under the terms of the county instability petition. That petition is being superseded as of this morning by a material witness protection order issued by Marshal Jonas Webb," she said, "which you will be able to verify when you return to Sawyer Creek and discover that Reuben Bates has been taken into custody and that my husband has been served with an obstruction notice." Gage sat on his horse and looked at her. "I know what you saw in Lubbock," she said. "The woman who was running with documents. I know she didn't reach anyone in time." His expression did not change. "I reached someone," she said. "This is different." Another silence. The sun was directly overhead now, and the heat was in full operation, and the three of them stood in it without moving the particular stillness of a moment that has reached the point where only one thing can happen next, and everyone present is waiting for it to happen. Gage reached into his coat. Elias's hand moved. Gage held up a folded document between two fingers. "Receipt of evidence," he said. "I am required to document what I found at the point of contact." He held it out toward Elias. "Sign it. And I have discharged my obligation to report to Hale that I found you, and that you had already transferred the documents to Webb. That's what I saw. That's what I'll report." He paused. "What he does with that information is his business." Elias looked at the document. He looked at Gage. "Why?" Gage was quiet for a moment. He looked at the flat horizon to the west, the way a man looks at something that is not there but that he is seeing anyway. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 12 years old. She lives with her mother in Fort Worth." He looked back at Elias. "I have been doing this work for 7 years, and I have never once been able to tell her what her father does that she would be proud of." He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and has decided in this specific moment to set down. "Today I can." Ruth looked at him. "You could testify," she said carefully, "to the Lubbock case, to what Hale instructed you to do there." I know, Gage said. It would help. I know that too, he said. He looked at the document in his hand. Sign the receipt. Let me go back and report what I found. Give me 2 days to think about the rest. Elias took the document. He looked at it. He signed it with the stub of pencil Gage produced from his coat pocket and handed it back. Gage took it. He folded it and put it in his coat. He looked at Ruth one more time. Your father ruled on a grazing rights case in 1871, he said. Small rancher named Perez against a consortium backed by Hale's money. Your father ruled for Perez. Everybody said he was wrong. The land records seemed to favor the consortium. He adjusted his hat against the sun. He wasn't wrong. I know because Hale sent me to that courthouse 2 days before the ruling to make sure certain documents were in the file. He paused. They weren't in the file when I got there. Your father had already removed them because he had identified them as fraudulent. He never said how. He just ruled, and he ruled right, and nobody understood why, except the men who had put the documents there. He looked at Ruth. He was paying attention the whole time. Every case, every document. He saw it. He just needed someone else to see it after him. He turned his horse and rode back north toward Sawyer Creek, and was gone. Ruth stood in the sun and did not move for a long moment. Elias stood beside her. He did not speak because there was nothing to say that was equal to what had just been said. Some things land in a person and need time to find where they belong before the person can move again. She found it. She straightened her back and picked up the saddlebag strap and looked north and started walking. They reached Aldridge's ranch in the early afternoon. Clara Aldridge saw them coming across the south field and had cold water on the table by the time they reached the porch. Tom Aldridge was sitting in his chair on the porch, and he looked at their faces when they came up the steps, and he nodded once the nod of a man who can read the conclusion of a thing in the way people carry themselves when they come back from it. Webb send word, Elias asked. Telegraph came an hour ago, Aldridge said. Bates is in custody. Talked before Webb had finished reading the charges. Apparently, he has been wanting to talk for 2 years, and just needed someone to offer him a reason that outweighed what he was afraid of. He looked at Ruth. Your husband filed an emergency appeal of the obstruction notice. The territorial judge in Abilene declined to hear it pending Webb's investigation. He paused. Gage came through heading north. He didn't stop. We know, Elias said. Clara Aldridge put a plate on the table and did not make an event of it, and Ruth sat down and ate with the steady, real hunger of someone who has finished a long piece of work and whose body has finally been given permission to acknowledge what it needed. Elias sat across from her, and Aldridge sat at the end of the table, and Clara sat at the other end, and for a while they just ate together in the plain, comfortable way of people who have been through something and have come out the other side of it into the ordinary world. The land file, Aldridge said to Elias eventually. Webb's message mentioned it, said he was initiating a deed review proceeding on the coal parcel. Elias set down his cup. Said that directly. Said it in the message, yes. Aldridge looked at him. You know what that land is worth now that Hale's hold on the water rights is being challenged? The South Fork parcel with the original water access restored is good land. Real good land. I know what it is, Elias said. You going back to it? Elias looked at the table. He thought about 40 acres on the South Fork with water that ran clear even in July. He thought about the graves there, his father and the small stone beside his father's that he had placed in February in the frozen ground, with hands that had not felt anything for 3 days before and had not felt anything for 3 days after. He thought about what Ruth had said at the Casado crossing, not to escape something, to build something. Yes, he said. I'm going back to it. The trial of Douglas Hale opened in the Territorial Court in Abilene in October, 2 months after the events at the Casado crossing. Ruth McAllister testified for 3 days. She presented the ledger. The chain of evidence with the same sequential clarity she had presented to Webb at the survey marker, and the packed courtroom heard every word in the particular silence of people who understand they are witnessing an accounting that has been a long time coming. Reuben Bates testified for 2 days. He told the truth, all of it. His hands did not shake the way they had shaken in Judge McAllister's parlor 4 years earlier, because the shaking had been fear, and the fear had been of Hale's reach, and Hale's reach was now a hand that no longer held anything. Bates told the truth the way men tell it, when the truth is the last thing they own. Delphine Okafor testified from Abilene, where she had been living with her daughter since August. She described the vest. She described the North Road, and the wagon without a lantern, and the ink on the pale hands in the moonlight. She described it precisely without embellishment in the plain, steady voice of a woman who has waited a long time to say a thing in a room where it would be properly heard. Judge Hargrove, who presided, instructed the jury that the testimony of all witnesses was to be weighed on the same evidentiary standard regardless of the witness's race, gender, or social position. He said it directly and plainly, and entered it into the record, and if it was not a revolution, it was at least a marker, a stone set in the ground at a specific point in time that said this far and no further. Gage testified on the 3rd day. He described the Lubbock case. He described 4 years of instructions from Douglas Hale. He described a man who understood that the machinery of the law was most dangerous when it was turned against the people it was supposed to protect, and who had used it with the patience and precision of someone who had never once believed that the rules applied to him. He testified in the flat professional voice he used for everything, and when he was finished, he looked at the jury, and he looked at Ruth, and then he looked at the back wall, and said nothing further. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. The conviction was on all primary counts: fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsification of public records, and the charge that had never been available before Ruth's testimony gave it shape: criminal misuse of judicial process for personal enrichment. Warren Tilden accepted a plea agreement on the obstruction charge. He was fined and removed from any public fiduciary role for life. The instability petition was formally vacated by the court and expunged from the county record by order of Judge Hargrove, who called it in his written opinion an instrument of control masquerading as compassion. That phrase appeared in 3 Texas newspapers the following week. Ruth was in the courthouse hallway when the verdict was read. She had asked to wait outside, not from weakness, but from the particular private way she processed things that mattered most. Elias stood beside her when the door opened, and the sound of the room reached them, and she stood very still for a moment, with her eyes closed and her hands quiet at her sides. And then she opened her eyes, and she looked at the high window at the end of the hallway, where the October light was coming in thin and golden, the way autumn light comes in when it is trying its best. "He would have known what to do with this," she said. "Your father," Elias said. "He would have filed it, written up the ruling in his careful handwriting, put it in the right place so the right person could find it when they needed it." She looked at the light. "He would have cried about it later privately when no one was watching. He was that kind of man, feeling everything on the inside and only letting the work show on the outside." "Good kind of man," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "He was." Tom Aldridge's ranch had a dinner that evening that Clara Aldridge produced from what appeared to be nothing and turned into something that smelled like everything a person could want after a long season of hard things. Webb was there, and Aldridge and Agnes Delphine with her daughter and Gage came to the door at 7 o'clock and stood on the porch until Ruth went to the door and looked at him and opened it wider without a word. And he came in and sat at the end of the table and did not say much and ate everything on his plate. After dinner, Elias went outside to the porch. The October evening was cool, the first real cool of the season, the air finally having decided to become fall after a summer that had held on past its welcome. He stood on the porch and looked at the dark flat land to the north, where somewhere past the distance the South Fork ran clear over its stones and 40 acres of his father's ground was waiting. He heard the door behind him, and Ruth came out and stood beside him. They stood in the quiet for a moment together. Millstone is 40 miles from Stone Creek, she had said in a story that was not theirs. But Sawyer Creek was 60 miles from the South Fork parcel, and 60 miles in good weather on a known road was a half-day's ride, and a woman who had studied medicine in Philadelphia and run 14 days through the Texas summer with a forged vest and a dead man's ledger pressed against her ribs was not a woman who would find 60 miles a serious obstacle when she had reason to cover it. He did not say any of that. He looked at the dark, and she looked at the dark beside him, and the distance between them on that porch was the particular distance of two people who have been through something together and have arrived at the place after it where things are possible that were not possible before. "I'll be at the South Fork by November," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I hear there's no doctor in the county north of Sawyer Creek," she said. "I hear that too," he said. "That's a problem that wants solving." "It does," he said. She looked at the dark. He looked at the dark. The cool air moved between them and around them, and the October stars were out over the flat Texas land, and somewhere in the house behind them, Clara Aldridge was laughing at something Tom Aldridge had said, and the sound of it came through the wall, warm and unremarkable and real. He reached into his chest pocket. His hand found the silver thimble, the way it always found it by feel, by the specific small weight and temperature of it. He held it for a moment through the fabric of his jacket. He thought about Margaret walking the South Fork in the early morning in the years before everything went wrong, stopping to pick up stones from the water, the way she liked to, turning them over in her palm to look at the wet color of them, and smiling at whatever she found. He thought about what Ruth had said at the Casado crossing. People teach each other things. He took the thimble out of his pocket. He held it in his open palm in the dark, where he could not see it, but could feel the cool, smooth weight of it, the perfectly ordinary object that had been the most important thing he owned for 9 months. He held it for a long time, and then carefully, with the deliberate intention of a man who has decided something and is honoring the decision with the full weight of the action. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. The deepest one, the one closest to his chest, the one that held things that were permanent, rather than things that were in transit. Not lost, not left behind, carried forward, into the next piece of land, and the next piece of building, and the next piece of whatever life decided to place in front of a man who had stopped running away from things and was finally genuinely walking toward them. Ruth looked at him. She had watched what he did, and she did not look away from it, and she did not say a word about it, which was exactly right, because some things do not need commentary. Some things only need a witness who understands their weight. "November," she said. "November." He agreed. The land they were going back to had been waiting. The water on the South Fork had been running under the summer-baked earth all through the long hot season. Patient and continuous the way things run when they know where they are going and are not in any hurry, because arriving was never the point. Moving was the point, and the moving never stopped. In the spring, the yellow flowers would come up along the creek bank before anything else came up exactly as they always had, because the world keeps its oldest promises, whether anyone is watching or not. And there would be someone watching. There would be two people watching standing in the early light of a Texas spring morning at the edge of the South Fork, where the water ran clear over its stones, and whatever was between them by then would be the accumulated weight of everything they had carried to get there. The ledger, and the vest, and the silver thimble, and the 14 days, and the dollar in the dust, and the sentence that started it all spoken in a forge on a July morning by a woman who had not been broken by any of it. Some things, once they are true, stay true. That was one of them. It was enough. It was the whole of everything.